I am Dr. Kate Helsen, and I'm going to take my mask off now because no one is within 2 meters of me, and I hope I'll be a little bit more articulate this way. I'm here because normally I would be introducing this manuscript to you in person, and of course we can't do that right now. So this is the next best thing. I'm hoping to be able to talk about this book in 3 different ways. The first way is codicologically, so that is simply what this thing is in the world physically, what kind of materials it's made out of, how it was put together, the kinds of the evidence or the way that that we can tell what came first and what came next. Just given this book, we do a little bit of detective work that way. And I'm also going to model for you how I would encounter a book so that when you go and try to do this on your own, maybe sometime you have a little bit of a schema, a way of going about. So the first bit of this is this particular book as a codicology experiment. And that means also that you, let's say you're not particularly interested in music, which is what this book has inside it. You can still think about this book as a material object in the world the way you would with a book with anything inside it, tax records or the history of kings or whatever it is. This particular book goes by its library sigla, which is on the inside of this board cover here, because back when the university got it, they felt great about stamping the first page, which you'll see in a second here when we do the close-ups, with UWO Music Library on the front and on the first page that exists, and we also have some paste-in library sigla stamps. So this is M2150, and the date, people are still a little bit unsure as to exactly when it was made, but we have been saying 16th century, and some of the scientific data that comes back in the various tests that we've done comes in that ballpark. I am also going to tell you why maybe the precise dating is not as important as what this thing is in the world and how it is a kind of a standard for a type of book that looks like this that was common all over Europe around that time. Codicology is not only the materials, but I'm also in this segment going to talk to you a little bit about paleography, and that is the study of the writing of it. Now, because this is music, we've got 2 types. We've got the textual paleography, and then we've got the musical paleography. And in that we have notation. So I'm going to try to break it up into, first we're just going to talk about the material culture, but then we're also going to talk about how it was written, the style of writing, and where things are placed on the page as though it was a kind of a plan, a geometry, as it were. So I'm going to start off by describing what's in front of us. We don't have a weight right now, but that's not always completely necessary. And most of the time, if you meet a book, it will not be this heavy. I don't know, it's a heavy book. And the reason that it's heavy is not just that it's got great big thick pieces of parchment in here, it's mostly due to the covering of it, which is wood, and also these metal, what they're called bosses. These are Catherine wheels, so they look like wheels with little bumps on the top of them, and they are both on the front and the back cover. And that together makes all of this, and then we also have metal reinforcements at the corners, of course, and at the bottoms here and top here, and that makes it a very heavy beast. There's also, we can see here, evidence that there would have been leather straps binding it. The leather here is still a little bit left. Here we can see it's been ripped away at some point. So the leather came with, when the leather came off, it took apart the way the leather was bound into the board as well. So there's this rip right here, you can see, but this one is still intact. So we can see the way it would have been bound into underneath the covering, but into the wood. Now, I normally ask the class at this point, what is the purpose of these metal guys at the front, and also just so you can tell I'm not lying, here they are in the back. And although they look cool, it's not just for decoration. The way books like this, especially the service books in monasteries and libraries, that kind of thing, that wouldn't be used for most of the year and then would be brought out. They weren't reference texts throughout the year. They would not spend their lives vertical, like the books that you see behind me, or like we're used to in archives and libraries now. They would spend their lives this way, down, flat, and they would be in a pile of books like this. And of course, in the summer or when it got hot, this is leather, and the leather would bind to the leather of the next book on top of it because it would be very heavy. If this is 45 or 50 pounds, then just magnify that up. And then when you went to go get it, of course, you'd be ripping leather and it would be stuck and it wouldn't be good. So these little things are called either bosses or whatever you want to call them, Catherine wheels. They make a little bit of space between the book underneath and the book above. And of course, the book above, you also have to imagine, has something like this. So it keeps them a little bit apart, a little bit of air can get through, and it's not going to be binding itself if it finds itself in a stack as easily. So I also wanted to talk, just before we get into the actual book, about the embossing on the front of it. This is again, it's something that this book has seen a lot. My nickname for it is the Ratty Antiphoner, and that's because the embossing is almost hard to see now. But this kind of book would often have, as a kind of a decoration, as just something to make it more beautiful in the world, the leather over the board would be impressed, sort of pressed down, stamped, with lovely little detailing. And so you'll see a close-up of that. That also, of course, on the back as well. Some of it has been completely scuffed off, but we can still see what would have been there. This one is a fairly standard stamp, I would say, with very, very small detailing in the middle of it, which echoes a little bit of what we find in some of the illumination of the letters inside as well, of the initial letters. To open it, I wanted, just before we get into what's here, to look a little bit on this side. And just to show you, for example, that there are little wormholes that have developed through this board, and also to show you how the leather coming over this board as the hardcover has been fixed with nails. You can see that there's some nails that are still intact. Some of them have come out, of course, the smaller ones, but you can still see where they would have been. And you can see the kind of the folds, all of that. So that is something to bear in mind. Now, one other thing, when I open this book, I can tell right away two things. The first is that this page is not the first page of the manuscript originally. That's obvious because you've got all of these cutout pages here. We'll talk about that in a second. But I can also tell that when this was shut for a long time and nobody really was using it anymore, and it was more of an artifact than it was a musical score, it was the page that was facing this hardcover was also not the first page. Because what we expect in the first page of a manuscript like this is going to be a big initial letter with maybe some detailing, and then a first line that's sort of larger, written larger, and then you'd start into the way the rest of the manuscript would look. And you can see here that we're just on a regular page, and it's bled through onto the wood because the ink has bled through, but we can tell that it was already harvested a bit for something else before it spent years and years and years shut. So it's had a hard life. The worms and the harvesting and all the rest of it. When it's open now, I can tell you a little bit about the binding. And there are some really cool websites which I'll in the course, I'll also point you to, as to how books like this were actually physically put together. What you can see in this book, why I love this book to show to students, is you can actually see the cords that are binding it in the various ways. So you have these smaller cords running up and down the spine, and then you have these larger ones that are bound and reinforced this way that gather all the gatherings together, loop up through, and then bind them to the two sides of the cover, which means that along the spine we get those cords grabbing the spine of the book and fixing it to the front and back. And then when they put the leather over, of course, you've got these bumps. I think a lot of people look at books like this, old books, see those bumps and wonder maybe what they're for. That's what's going on here. So you can actually see this one here going around it, holding all the gatherings together. Now, I need to tell you a little bit about how the pages were then sewn in, like what the binding is about. Imagine that I'm going to make this book, and I have in front of me not pages that are this big, all stacked up in a row like you might imagine now, just single leaf pages. But I have what's called bifolia. They span across the whole book. Here's one. This'll do. Right. So this is one big long sheet of parchment. And it would have been inscribed and all the notation, everything done, and then laid down flat, and the next one on top of it, and the next one on top of it. It varies how many of these big bifolia you would have on top before you would then fold it like a sandwich. And that folding, that chunk now that you have is called a gathering or a quire, if you want that term, Q-U-I-R-E. And then those folded together sections would then be sewn together at their spine. So it would be as though, this is a Western exam booklet. So here I have it open at the center, so that would be this, and then I would fold them together, and this would be my gathering. In this case, this gathering of the exam booklet has 4 folia, we would say. You call this a folio when you're talking about both sides of the page, or 8 pages if you want. And then those are, imagine 3 of these stacked on each other and then sewn along here to keep together in the right order. This is important because when you look at a book like this, the first thing you do is count the pages, because you want to know how many pages there are. That's another one of those things. You measure it, etc. And you find in this book, for example, this book has a little under 100 pages. I think we find 97 folia in here. And if we look at the spine and we see the gatherings and we know how many bifolia are in a gathering, and that number is 4, so we would stack 4 bifolia on top of each other, fold it together. Now we have 8 pages, if you will. And we should, when we then count along here, we can see those gatherings together, and we calculate that it should be about 200 here. So we're missing over half of the book. You can tell that from all of this lovely damage here, but it also goes through the book. There are 19 different places in this book where there have been pages taken out. Now, when we actually look inside of this manuscript, it looks nice. It looks very interesting to us, especially musicians that want to know how this stuff sounded, maybe. But it's not, I think we could fairly say, one of the most beautiful examples of manuscript. It's a kind of a run-of-the-mill thing. So why is it? Why have there been so much? Why has been cut away so much? What's going on? And why throughout? Right? If they're just going to reuse parchment for some reason, just take it from the front once you're done with it, that kind of thing. So there's a couple different reasons that people have floated. Of course, nobody really knows in the case of this particular one, but there are a couple different reasons that we can think of why it's in this shape. And the first reason is that when this book would have been obsolete, that is, another book would have come along that had more updated chants, or was maybe a little smaller, or was a new use, somebody wanted to put some new chants in there, and this fell out of use. Of course, the parchment is still good as a reinforcement of the new parchment that would form the new book. So what I mean by that is, we talked about these gatherings, these folds. And what you find a lot in books, and this book too, has used other books and cut these strips along other books, parchment pages, folios, and use that to reinforce the folding of the choir, of the gathering that they have going on here. So here, for example, we have, running along this margin, a strip of parchment that's been bonded to the fold, just so that it can withstand the sewing that's going to go through it, and it's not going to crack, and it's not going to tear as much. It's going to be thicker. So oftentimes you find that manuscripts that have fallen out of use and that were kind of daily use manuscripts anyway, they weren't gift manuscripts, they didn't have gold and jewels everywhere in them, they would be harvested for the making of new manuscripts. So that might have been what happened to some of it. Especially, for example, if we're going to say that, you know, this, when it spent a long time shut and then got this bleed through, then this wasn't the front page. Perhaps it was already being used in that way before it then got further reduced. And the second thing that we might imagine for this, as in terms of its history, is we need to look a little bit at how Western came to get this book. And we don't know that much. We know that it was sold to Western by a book dealer in the 1960s, and that, of course, that city is renowned for, on either bank of the Seine, you can walk along and you can buy, still today, beautiful folios of old manuscripts. And they're usually, the folios that people want to buy are usually the ones with the big, lovely initial letters, and maybe some music on them, something that is, it doubles, it's not just a musical score anymore, it's art, it's context, it's history, that kind of thing. And so it's quite possible that, I told you before that there's a lot taken out at the front here, but that there's 18 other places, the front is number 19, there's 18 other places in this book where there have been several leaves removed. And almost every time it corresponds with the beginning of a new occasion in the church, and that would have the nice big initial. So what we're thinking is maybe some of this is now hanging on people's walls as art. And of course the scribes would be proud and the singers would be incredibly frustrated because we couldn't ever start the beginning of our Vespers or whatever. I want to show you what I mean by a nice opening letter. Is a letter with two colors. It's not crazy, but it's got some red lettering on the top of it, and nice, neat notation underneath. So that one hasn't been taken. Others might have been. We'll never know for sure. When we count up the folios, as we said, we've got 97. So sometimes they can be really sneaky as to where they've been taken out. Here you can see there's been one folio removed. There's also been a lot of cutting along the margins. That's definitely used to bind or to reinforce something. Sometimes the cutting is really ragged. It even cuts into some of the design here. And then sometimes the cutting has been really almost impossible to tell that something has been taken out. So it's very important when you encounter a manuscript to look first at those gatherings and calculate how many pages you should have, and then go and see how many you actually do, and then you're at least alert to the idea that you might be skipping a page even when you don't think you are. And of course it's also difficult to tell how many pages unless you've got a firm grip on that gathering and the folios underneath. Just as an aside, we have here an example of something very much smaller book. This is a folio from a book which we assume is much, much more than just this one page, but as you can see, it has also been taken out of its book and lost its brothers and sisters, and for a while was just art on the wall. And you can see the little glue residue there where it would have been bound to the frame. So that happened to quite a few manuscripts, especially musical manuscripts, because people like looking at notation. And you will encounter that as you go around. And I know a couple people who have spent have a little bit of a side hobby trying to gather back up and figure out how manuscripts might have looked when you can find these one-off pages and put them back in some kind of order. There's a couple projects that do that digitally now, because of course much more is available around the world if you have a nice digital image of it, and then if you can figure out what you're missing and then maybe find it, it's kind of exciting. As a little bit of an aside, I just wanted to tell you that there's a few other instances that I've encountered of musical manuscripts and parchment thereof being used in odd ways after they're done being musical scores. And the first one was when I lived in Regensburg for 4 or 5 years. And there I went with, when I was doing my dissertation, I went with my supervisor one time to what used to be a hospital just outside of the old walls of Regensburg, Germany, where in the archives there, they had a bunch of tax records for that hospital. And the tax records were all kept in envelopes, parchment envelopes, that were themselves musical scores, manuscripts of chant from one of the local churches. And so the trick was to try to figure out if this was part of a book that we could then kind of reconstruct without damaging what was inside it, because of course the tax records were also really interesting to the historians, and we couldn't undo the way that they had been made into envelopes. So we had to look just at 1 or 2 words and try to figure out if that was in a chant that we knew about, and that kind of thing. So that's one place that I've seen that coming up, the reuse of manuscripts. And also, of course, a little later on, we've heard of Charpentier's manuscripts from Rome being sold as fish wrapping in the markets. And Handel apparently used to send his servants down to the markets to buy up stacks of musical scores that would have been used to wrap cheese or whatever, so that Handel could look through them and see if there were any good riffs that he could steal. So that's just a little aside. Now, I think we need, let's transition a little bit into more paleography world now. So now you've seen what the inside of this looks like a little bit. And you can see that it's really, we're talking about 3 colors of ink, really. We're talking about red, some of which has sort of faded in some places, depending on the kind of, whether it's a hair side or a flesh side of the parchment that you've got, because the hair side is slightly darker and the flesh side is slightly lighter as an animal, of course. But that makes the ink color appear slightly differently on either side of the folio. So we've got the red, we've got the black/brown, it's sort of browned up a bit, and we have blue, and the blue does the most detailed work in the illuminations of the initial letters that you can see. But that's it for this manuscript, which means, again, to me that this is a workaday manuscript. People sung from this. And it was not, for example, made as a costly gift to a king or any of that. There's no gold leaf in here anywhere. There's a little bit of yellow that you can still see that would sort of stand in for gold leaf or gold powder mixed in, and that yellow is used in the first half of the manuscript, not so much in the second. And so when you encounter a manuscript like this, make sure that you page all the way through and see what happens as you get near the end. In this manuscript, for example, what happens is you get a lot more initials that are simply done with the brown/black ink in nice calligraphy, but fewer of these blue and red ones. People have thought that it's possible that there are 2 different hands making these the fancy black ink initials, because it seems like there are 2 different styles going on. Maybe others would have more to say about that, but the idea is simply to note them, to know that they're there. Consistently across the board, these initials that are sort of boxed around and then have this very small detailing in the blue ink and then the red letter, they seem to be pretty consistent. Also, that's a style that you see in a lot of other manuscripts across Europe, not just from Spain. The Parisian dealer that sold it to Western said that it came from the Burgos Monastery in Granada, Spain. And musicologists have looked from stem to stern, and we can't find any evidence that that's true or not. And we'll get to why when we get to the musicological section. But let's pretend it's from Spain. It's nice. Now, looking more closely at the material itself, already talked a little bit about the hair side and the flesh side. I'm hoping that you'll see some close-ups. Here's a good one, for example. So now I'm on page 134, or 134 recto, that is. And then compared to 134 verso, that is the way we refer to the folio on either side, where you can see the hair follicles of the animal. This was sheep, and you can actually see the hair follicles of the animal still on the page here, and on this side of the page, of course, it's much smoother, a little bit whiter. So that's one thing to note: hair side, flesh side, how that works. Another thing is just to drive home the point that any vegans in the audience should feel incredibly uncomfortable at this point. We can see that there were repairs done on the parchment, on the skin of the animal, even before, in some cases, before it came to be a manuscript. This is because parchment is costly, and if there's a tiny little nick in the skin when you're preparing the skin to become parchment, what you can do is you can just sew it up, and it will actually bind itself back together as though it were living skin. And we can see evidence of this on the edge here, on the right margin. you'll see that this piece of parchment has been sewn together, and there's sewing and on either side. You can see the little holes right here. And also you can see that now there is no more, it won't come apart. So it's actually been binded together. So there's that one. There's also another one on 66. Let's see if I can find that one any easier. Oh yes, this is a long one. This is neat. So here, the imperfection ran along this way, so horizontally. It's been sewn, and then on the other side, it's been reinforced with another, probably just sort of a gummy substance with some parchment in it. But all of that came before the writing, because you can see the writing has come over top of the reinforcing. So they're preparing the parchment for its use as a book, even before it gets to the scribe. So when you're looking at a book like this, the other thing you need to do is measure. What we have here is the dimensions of the entire folio, a large folio, which is 55.6 by 38.7 centimeters. But then within that, of course, we have the actual writing area, which is smaller. But it would be consistent in one book. So this is one book, it's made to be one book. That's not always the case. So sometimes you can see when two different books have been put together, you can tell that because the writing area will be slightly different in terms of size. So they're preparing it as one thing. They know it's going to be bound together. And you'll see that sometimes when the margins have been cut off, sometimes you even get, this has been, they've kindly cut off the shorter folios so that we can still sing from them. It doesn't go into the actual notation, but there are these uneven margins that you should know about. The wormholes and imperfections go all the way across, so there are holes in these in the parchment, not so much in the middle, but in the front section definitely. You'll see the wormholes going all the way through. So when we think about putting together this manuscript from sheep to what's in front of me, we start with the idea that the parchment would have been prepared in ways that you can, there are lots of really neat videos on the internet about making parchment, how you do it. You stretch it out, you scrape off the hair, you let it dry for a couple of days. There are various thicknesses of parchment, and of course the animal that you're taking the parchment from is going to determine what that parchment looks like. For very, very costly manuscripts, earlier days than the 16th century are the ones that I've encountered. You can even get manuscripts that are made, if it's a very, very costly book, from parchment made of skin from animals that have never seen the sun. That is, they are born, they'll be animals it's called velum uterum, and so it's from the womb. So this is very, very, very delicate parchment. It almost feels like the tissue paper Bibles that people have now. And those are usually for books for kings and queens, and they have gold and all sorts of things all over them. Sheep, goat, that sort of thing is pretty regular for a workaday manuscript like this. And as I said, this is sheep. So if we start slightly after the sheep, and we imagine that we now have the parchment prepared and cut in roughly similar bifolia sizes for us, so that again it's not just one page size, it's not this as a page, we get it this way. The next thing that has to be done is it needs, each side of this bifolia needs to be scored and kind of planned out. So what you do is you take a little knife, a little scoring object, and you have a straight edge of some sort, and you measure each of the sides of each of the bifolia need to have the same writing area inside it. And also, if you're dealing with music, you need the same number of musical staff lines to be on each page, or if you know you're going to have a page like this where you've got a couple staff lines and then some text, that all needs to be planned out as well. Now, they're not conceiving of 200 pages of a manuscript just from the get-go in dry point. Usually these are made as copies of other manuscripts, so the people who are doing this preparation work know what they're preparing for. And it was a little bit of a kind of an assembly line, so you would have someone preparing a parchment and then they would know what that was going to be. Okay, there's going to be initial up here, there's going to be 3 lines of notation, whatever it was, and they could get that set up in that standardized way to then go to the next person down the line who would start writing out text. Again, as copying, so most of this stuff was made with an exemplar in front of the people making it. Now, to regulate how many lines are given to notation and text. This is done with text too, but I'm going to point it out in terms of the notation because I think it's interesting in this one to do it that way. What they would do is they would take a bunch of folia together, line them up, sometimes they would even put down a kind of a scoring device over top of it that was like a frame, and then they would string along it little pieces of cord and fix them on either end so that it was just this kind of model, this frame that they would put down over top, and then at every interval that they decided, 3 strings down or whatever, they would drive a pin and it would go straight down, not through 1 or 2 but maybe 5 or 6 pages at a time, and then count another 3 or 4 down. Another pinprick goes through all the way down. So even when there was nothing else on the page, you could draw out, you could imagine that line of music with the line of text underneath, and then have that be equal all the way down vertically, so you weren't cramming in at the last. So it looks kind of more standardized. And you can still see the pinpricks from where that happened. So here on page, on folio 65 recto, you can actually see the pinpricks, and they are regular at the bottom of where the text would run. So you can kind of still see the line on which the person writing the text has written their, it's mostly been scraped off, but there it is. And there's a pinprick at the end of that line. Pinprick down here, here, and here. So they are calculating everything from the line where the text goes and then up your staff lines and then to the next one. So those pinpricks are important to make note of when you see them. That's how we know that that's part of how this was all planned out. Then you would, on a given page, you would plan out where you were going to put your decorated initials and where you were going to have any kind of runovers or anything that was hanging out from a page before, if you had to get that in and then the initial. So you had to be cognizant of what was coming before and then what we were going into. When you see the way the layout, they didn't leave any space. So, for example, it happens to be on this page that we've got a line of music that keeps going here. Then we have some more music. It's not as complicated. It's just a reciting tone. So they've decided we don't need music here. We'll just write out the text, abbreviate it, stick it in this little bit that we would have used for score if we'd needed to go that far. And now we're going to go into our next reading that isn't musical. So sometimes when you encounter this, you think, oh, well, that's where the music stops. Well, the music actually keeps going, but they don't want to lose any space. So there is that. So they've got it kind of geometrically figured out how they're going to do everything. They'll score it off. The reason we know that that's the case is that sometimes we'll come across a manuscript that isn't quite done yet. Maybe they didn't get to the final jazzy bits with the initials, but you'll see the box around where the initial you would have been and where it was planned to be. So the next thing after they've got it all arranged is that then the text is added, and that is also, when you're dealing with musical manuscripts, the text that goes along underneath the staff lines, and the staff lines are also put in. So you've got, and this is not just as simple as write down the text, because sometimes you will have lots of notes going on one syllable. For example, here we've got impiorum, so impiorum, and the O has to stretch for that whole O, and now I put my last syllable here. So even before the note's there, the textual scribe has to understand that they need to spread those out, which again is usually fine because they have an exemplar there, but we know that that sometimes was a problem for the text scribes because they don't. And so sometimes the notation scribes are writing up the side because they haven't been left enough room by the text scribes. So that's why we know that the general process was text comes first. We only know that because of when it doesn't work, when there's been a mistake. So here on folio 133 verso, what has happened is that the textual scribe has decided that he needs all of this little bit, or she. We don't. So a lot of Cistercian nuns did this kind of work, but we don't know whether this was made by male or female scribes. But this little bit here, the text has been written as you would expect, but then the notation scribe has come along and said, excuse me, I'm not quite finished yet, and put the last 3 pitches right over some of the text. Now, fortunately, I think everybody knew what was going on because the text that has been written over is just a short form for psalm, just written, here's the psalm that you sing, and everybody would know that a psalm comes in that position, and so, you know, all is not lost. It's not like we're dealing with a deep, dark mystery. But the idea is, again, that you can see what came before what because of when it doesn't work. Now, the last thing then, once you have the text and the staff lines prepared, and then the notation comes on. That notation, we know that the notes come after the staff line, not only because that's what's practical, but also because when the coloring in, it's a kind of a slightly thinner ink that they use when they color in these square note heads, it starts to chip off. And you can see the line, the red staff line underneath it. Let's see if I can find a good example of that. Well, there's the front. These are the easy examples. In the very front, which is fading anyways, you can definitely see that where the ink is coming off on the note head, you can see the red line going through. Then it's given to the illuminators. Now, in this particular manuscript's case, they don't have a lot to do, except these fancy initials from time to time. They tend to put the fanciest ones at the beginnings of things. So, for example, here's a Compline service, and here's the antiphon that begins this Compline service, and it's Alleluia, 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 because here we are at Easter. I'll get to that in the next section. But they'll mark that stuff with the colored initials, and then the initial, the large written letters that come that are not using all of these colors are usually just restarts in the middle of chants, or let's say it's another verse of a hymn or something like that. They'll make it bigger. You'll draw the eye, but you won't actually signal, okay, this is the beginning of something new with that color. Now, illumination maybe could stand a few words. In this case, I can't really illustrate illumination because, of course, we're not dealing with gold. But I think it has been said to me, anyway, that the idea of illuminating, that is bringing light actually to the manuscript, comes from this idea of using gold and also other colors that are going to pick up light and bring that idea into the very books that they're using. So it's not just coming in through the stained glass windows or whatever, but it's also in the actual book. You can catch the light. They would do things with, especially the gold leaf, where they would put the jessup, they'd get a kind of a gluey substance that would congeal a little bit, make the flat folio a little bit 3D, and then put the gold leaf over that, and then wait till it dried and scuff away the excess, so that all you had was this little golden bead, or this little, and it would catch the light differently as you turned the page, or as you stood and looked at it from different angles. So it really was, the illuminators were in the business of light, as well as in the business of making little cartoons of funny people's faces and things like that. There's all sorts of, well, anyone who's been on the internet and is a geek like me has been to one of the sites where people have gathered all the sketches of medieval rabbits doing weird things or whatever it is, that sometimes populate either big initials or running along the margins, anything like that. Now, once that is all together, remember my gatherings. So once you have it all flat like this, and you fold it together, you send it off to someone else who's going to bind it. Binder. So that's not the scribe. They haven't been part of this whole process, and they might not have the exemplar in front of them. So how do they know that this gathering comes third deep and in front of this one? How does that all work? Well, we can find evidence of planning for that too, and that's what we call catchwords. And sometimes we will find them still. A lot of times in the better sort of gift manuscripts, they've been scratched out. But in this one, they haven't, and so we can actually see evidence of this. So here on 80 verso and leading into the next gathering, you can see if you were to do a close-up, you'd see that this is one chunk of a gathering, the spine facing this way, and this is another one facing the other way. You can see this tiny little letters here, CE. They're running perpendicular to the rest of the way the manuscript goes, and those are catch letters, because they correspond with the first two letters of the next gathering. And so up here you can see CE. And so when the binders get them together, they say, oh, okay, we're looking for the next gathering that starts with CE, got it, okay, put it in, and there you go. So that happens quite a bit, and when people see odd symbols at the bottoms of folios that they're not sure what that is, oftentimes that's, you just look at the next folio, see if it's what you think it is, and it also helps when you're trying to figure out your lacunae or the things that have been taken out. If you see a catchword at the bottom of one gathering and you don't see the corresponding next section of text, then you know maybe something's missing.